The year was 1875, and the wind over the Texas Panhandle had teeth. It was a dry, scouring wind that lifted the red dust off the Llano Estacado and flung it into the streets of Adobe Crossing, coating everything in a fine grit. It worked its way into the seams of a person's clothes, into the folds of their eyes, and settled like a bitter powder on the tongue. The sun was a hammer in a brass sky, beating down on the vast, shimmering grasslands that stretched to a horizon so empty it could make a soul ache with loneliness. Through this land, the Canadian River cut a lazy, silver ribbon, its banks dotted with the promise of life in the form of stubborn, deep-rooted cottonwood trees. Adobe Crossing was less a town and more a raw nerve ending on the edge of civilization. It was a place of transit, a temporary stop for the great herds of longhorns moving north, for the freight wagons groaning under the weight of supplies, and for the railroad crews laying down the iron spine that would change the world. A trading post, run by a man of mixed Mexican and Apache blood, served as the town's heart, a place where languages and cultures bled into one another. Comanche, Mexican, and the clipped talk of white men mingled with the smell of coffee, leather, and dust. Into this crucible of heat and ambition rode Eliza Keene. At 27, she carried herself with a purpose that many found unsettling in a woman traveling alone. Her hair was the color of dark honey, pinned up against the nape of her neck, though rebellious strands always escaped to whip across her face in the wind. Her eyes were a clear, steady gray, and they missed very little. She was a photographer and a freelance telegraph operator, two professions that relied on capturing moments, one in light and silver, the other in coded clicks of electricity. She had come west not for a husband or a homestead, but to write a story in pictures and words about the land treaties, to document the truth of promises made and broken on this red earth. She dreamed of a small studio of her own, a place where light was her servant, and a home that was more than just a rented room, a place to put down roots, just like those cottonwoods. Her most precious possession was a large, cumbersome box camera made of polished mahogany and brass. It was a heavy, awkward thing, but to Eliza, it was an instrument of truth. On its wet glass plates, she could freeze a moment, trap a sliver of reality, and hold it up for the world to see. It was a kind of magic, a way to make the fleeting permanent. She believed in the power of a single, unblinking image to tell a story more honestly than 1,000 words. From a low bluff overlooking the town, a man watched her arrival. His name was Chasen of the Morning, though most just called him Chasen. He was a warrior of the Numunu, the people. But his past was complicated. He had once worn the blue coat of the United States Cavalry, serving as a scout. His knowledge of the land used by the very men who sought to tame it. He had seen too much, guided them to places that were later scarred by their presence, and the weight of that time had settled deep within him. Now, he was home, back among his people, but the world had changed. The great herds of buffalo, the lifeblood of the Numunu, were dwindling, their numbers ravaged by hide hunters and the relentless westward push of the railroad. Chasen's goal was simple and profound. He wanted to protect the sacred hunting grounds of his ancestors, to keep them from being silenced by the hiss of steam engines and the thunder of repeating rifles that left the plains littered with carcasses. He carried a knife sheathed at his hip, its blade chipped from a piece of black obsidian. It was not a weapon of war, but a tool, a piece of his history. The stone held the memory of the earth, of fire and pressure, and in its sharp edge, Chasen felt the connection to the generations of his people who had lived and died on this land. He watched the woman with the strange wooden box unload her gear, his face impassive, his eyes missing nothing. She was another sign of the changing world, another piece that did not seem to fit. The town of Adobe Crossing was run by more than just a weary marshal. It was run by the quiet, heavy influence of Luther Pike, a man whose ambition was as vast as the plains themselves. Pike was a cattle baron who had grown rich on beef and land, and now he was a contractor for the railroad, his fortune swelling with every mile of track laid. He was a man with a wide smile and cold eyes, and he saw the land not for its beauty or its history, but for its value in dollars per acre. Working alongside him, though rarely seen in public together, was Colonel Brackett, a military officer whose uniform was a little too clean, his posture a little too stiff. Brackett's greed was a quiet, festering thing, hidden behind a veneer of duty and order. He saw the treaties not as sacred promises, but as temporary obstacles to be overcome, and where Pike and Brackett needed a more delicate touch, they employed a man named Hale, a Pinkerton agent. Hale was a shadow in a dusty bowler hat, a man who moved quietly and listened more than he spoke. He was a professional meddler, skilled in the art of creating trouble that others would be blamed for. Together, these three men were weaving a net. Their plan was simple and cruel. They would stage raids, attacks on settlers and freight wagons, carried out by men disguised as native warriors. With enough fear and bloodshed, the treaties would be declared void. The military would be called in to pacify the territory, and the land would be opened up for Pike's cattle and his railroad at a fraction of its true cost. The seed of this deception was already being planted in the soil of Adobe Crossing. Eliza felt the town's judgment the moment she stepped down from the stagecoach. The rules of propriety, so rigid back east, were different here, but they were no less strict. A woman alone was an object of suspicion and speculation. The glances from the cowhands lounging on the saloon porch were bold and appraising. The whispers of the town's few respectable women followed her like her own shadow. She was an anomaly, and the frontier did not suffer anomalies gladly. She saw the same suspicion, amplified 100 times, directed at the Mexican families and the few Numanu who came into town to trade. Here, the law was whatever a man with a gun in his hand said it was, and the court of public opinion was swift and unforgiving. That evening, in the cramped, stuffy room she rented above the general store, Eliza carefully unpacked her photographic plates. The air smelled of dust and old wood. As she sorted through the heavy glass squares, her fingers brushed against one wrapped separately in dark cloth. She paused, a knot tightening in her stomach. She unwrapped it carefully. The plate was undeveloped, a latent image held in its chemical skin, but she knew exactly what it contained. Days earlier, on her journey west, her coach had stopped near a secluded canyon, seeking a bit of privacy and a chance to capture the stark landscape. She had wandered away from the road with her camera. It was then that she had seen them, Luther Pike and Colonel Brackett, their heads close together in conversation, their face grim and serious in the harsh sunlight. A third man, Hale, had stood watch nearby. It was a secret meeting, held far from prying eyes. An instinct had told Eliza it was important. Acting on that impulse, she had set up her camera, the big wooden box concealing her actions, and captured the moment. The click of the shutter had been no louder than a snapping twig, but it had felt like a gunshot in the silence. She had packed the plate away, a secret she did not yet understand, a piece of frozen truth that felt dangerous in her hands. She sat on the edge of the lumpy mattress, the undeveloped plate resting on her lap. The weight of it was more than just glass and silver nitrate. It was a burden. She had come west to document truth, but she had not expected to stumble upon a secret that felt so heavy, so menacing. The town outside was settling down for the night, the sounds of a tinny piano from the Sage Hen Saloon drifting up through her floorboards. She felt a profound sense of being alone, a small point of light in a vast, encroaching darkness. She thought of the river and the single emassive cottonwood tree that grew near the main crossing, its leaves rustling in the endless wind. She had noticed it as she arrived, a landmark of endurance. It had seen generations of people come and go, its roots holding fast in the shifting soil. It felt like a promise that some things could endure, that strength could be found even in this harsh, unforgiving land. She needed to believe that. Holding the glass plate, she made a quiet vow to herself. She would build her studio, she would build her home, and she would find a way to bring what was hidden on this plate into the light. Miles away, Chasen sat by a small, smokeless fire, the obsidian knife in his hand. He was carving a piece of cottonwood bark, the shavings falling at his feet. He was not thinking of the town, or the woman with the box of light. He was thinking of the buffalo. He remembered the sound of a herd on the move, a sound like thunder that shook the ground and filled the heart. He remembered the smell of them, a rich, dusty, living smell. And he remembered the silence that now grew in the places where they used to run. The silence was what he fought against. He looked up at the sky, a vast canopy of stars undimmed by city lights. His people had read their stories in these stars for 1,000 years. Now, a new story was being written across the land in iron and smoke. He did not know what his part in it would be, but he knew he would not stand by and watch the silence win. The red dust line had been drawn, and on either side, people were choosing their ground, whether they knew it or not. The quiet before the storm had begun. The sun was high and hot, baking the dust on the road to a fine red powder that rose in choking clouds with every turn of the mail wagon's wheels. Eliza Keene sat beside the driver, a leather-faced man named Silas, her hand resting protectively on the wooden crate that held her camera and plates. She was returning from a short trip to a neighboring settlement, having sent a telegraph message and replenished her supply of chemicals. The familiar, sprawling emptiness of the Llano Estacado surrounded them, a landscape that could feel like freedom one moment and a prison the next. The crack of a rifle split the afternoon silence. The lead horse screamed and stumbled, pitching forward in a tangle of leather and dust. The wagon lurched violently, throwing Eliza against the seat as Silas fought the reins, his curses swallowed by a second gunshot. From the rocky outcrops lining the road, figures emerged. They were on horseback, their faces smeared with garish paint, feathers tied in their hair. They let out high, whooping cries that seemed practiced, theatrical. Silas reached for the shotgun beneath his seat, but a bullet tore through the wooden footboard, and he slumped over without a sound. The wagon ground to a halt. Eliza's heart hammered against her ribs. A frantic bird trapped in a cage. Two of the attackers dismounted, their movements jerky and unnatural. They were dressed in buckskin, but it was ill-fitting, and the way they carried their rifles was clumsy, lacking the fluid grace she had observed in the Numunu, who came to the trading post. One of them yanked open her door and grabbed her arm, his grip bruising. His eyes, beneath the paint, were a pale, cold blue. He dragged her from the wagon, his partner moving to ransack the mailbags. They were after something specific. The man with the blue eyes shoved her toward her equipment crate. "Open it," he grunted, his voice a low rasp that held no trace of a native accent. Fear gave way to a cold spike of anger. He wanted her camera. He wanted the plate. Before she could answer, a shadow detached itself from the rocks above them. It moved with a speed that was almost impossible to follow. There was no shout, no warning. A bow sang its deadly song, and the blue-eyed man stiffened, an arrow suddenly sprouting from his shoulder. He staggered back, his rifle clattering to the ground. His partner spun around, raising his own weapon, but the shadow was already there, a whirlwind of controlled fury. It was Chasen. He moved like the wind itself, his obsidian knife a dark gleam in the sunlight. He did not kill. He disarmed, disabled, a blur of motion that was both terrifying and beautiful. The second man went down with a cry of pain as Chasen's foot swept his legs out from under him. The two remaining riders, seeing the sudden turn of events, dug their heels into their horses and fled, disappearing back into the rocks as quickly as they had appeared. The two on the ground scrambled to follow, the one with the arrow in his shoulder clutching the shaft as he ran. Silence descended once more, broken only by the whimpering of the injured horse and the buzzing of flies. Chasen stood over the spot where the men had been, his chest rising and falling evenly. He looked at Eliza, his dark eyes searching her face, but his expression was unreadable. He then knelt, his attention drawn to the ground. Shaking, Eliza pushed herself to her feet. Her first thought was for Silas. A quick check showed he was unconscious but alive, a bloody graze along his temple. Her second thought was for her camera. A wave of nausea washed over her. The heavy mahogany box had been thrown from the wagon and lay splintered on the ground. The lens was cracked, and the plate holder, the one containing the undeveloped image of Pike and Brackett, had been smashed. A shard of glass lay on the red dust. The faint, ghostly image of two men in conversation still visible for a fraction of a second before the harsh sun bleached it into nothingness. They had not just attacked the male. They had attacked the truth. Her eyes scanned the ground, her photographer's instinct for detail taking over. Near the fallen rifle? Something glinted. She bent and picked it up. It was a brass shell casing, still warm to the touch. A Spencer carbine round, Army issue. Her mind raced. That was not a weapon favored by the Comanche. Footsteps crunched on the road. Marshal Thompson, the law in Adobe Crossing, arrived with 2 deputies and, to Eliza's dismay, the Pinkerton agent, Hale. The marshal was a large man with a drooping mustache and eyes that seemed permanently tired of the troubles of the world. He took in the scene with a slow, deliberate gaze that lingered far too long on Chasen. "Well now," the marshal said, his voice a low drawl. "Looks like you caught yourself one of the raiding party. Miss Keene." Eliza stared at him, bewildered. "Caught one marshal. This man saved me. The attackers fled." Hale stepped forward, his smile thin and unpleasant. "A convenient story. We have a wounded stagecoach driver, a ransacked mail wagon, and a Comanche warrior standing here with a knife. It paints a rather clear picture." "That is absurd," Eliza said, her voice rising. "He drove them off. I saw it with my own eyes." She held out the shell casing, and they were using Spencer carbines. "Look." Marshal Thompson barely glanced at it. He waved a dismissive hand. "They use whatever they can steal. Everyone knows that." He turned his full attention to Chasen, who had remained silent and still throughout the exchange, watching the men with an unnerving calm. "Chasen of the morning, you are under arrest for the attack on this mail coach and the assault of its driver. The injustice of it was a physical blow. You cannot be serious," Eliza gasped. "He is the hero here, not the villain." But the marshal's mind was made up, or perhaps it had been made up for him long before he arrived. The deputies moved in, their pistols drawn. Chasen did not resist. He simply stood, a figure of immense dignity in the face of a lie, and allowed them to bind his hands as they led him away. His eyes met Eliza's for a brief, searing moment. In them, she saw not defeat, but a flicker of something else. A deep, weary anger that resonated with her own. That evening, the Sage Hen Saloon was thick with the smell of whiskey, sweat, and simmering tension. The news of the attack, and the marshal's subsequent arrest, had spread through Adobe Crossing like a prairie fire. Eliza pushed through the swinging doors, her jaw set. She had cleaned the dust from her face and clothes, but she could not scrub away the cold fury that had settled in her heart. She found the marshal and Hale at a corner table, a bottle between them. "Marshal Thompson," she said, her voice cutting through the saloon's low murmur. He looked up, annoyed. "Miss Keene, this is not a place for a lady." "I am not here as a lady. I am here as a witness to a crime, one that you are actively ignoring." She placed the Spencer cartridge on the table. It landed with a sharp click. "This is evidence. Evidence you refuse to even look at." Hale picked it up, rolling it between his thumb and forefinger. "A piece of brass. Miss Keene, it proves nothing. You are an outsider. You do not understand the way things are here." "I understand the difference between right and wrong," she shot back. "I understand that you have imprisoned an innocent man to avoid finding the guilty ones." The marshal sighed. "A theatrical display of patience. He is a Comanche. They were dressed like Comanches. It is simple enough for me." Eliza leaned forward, her hands flat on the sticky table. "It is too simple. It is a lie. You and I both know it." Her eyes flicked to Hale, whose smug expression infuriated her. A reckless idea sparked in her mind. A bluff. A dangerous one. You and the marshal are content to deal in smoke and rumor, but you should know. I deal in facts. I deal in light. I had a photograph. A picture of a very interesting and very private meeting. A meeting that might explain why certain powerful men would benefit from stirring up trouble with the Numunu. Those men who attacked me today were not just trying to rob the mail. They were trying to destroy that photograph. The air at the table grew thick and cold. The marshal's weary expression sharpened. Hale's thin smile vanished completely. For the first time, she saw a flicker of genuine alarm in his eyes. "You are talking nonsense," Hale said, his voice a low hiss. "Am I?" Eliza straightened up, her heart pounding but her voice steady. "You can break a glass plate, but you cannot break an idea. You have made a grave mistake. You arrested my rescuer, and now you have made me your enemy." She turned and walked out of the saloon, the silence that followed her more telling than any shout. She knew she had crossed a line. The bluff about the photograph had turned her from a nuisance into a threat. As she hurried down the dusty main street, the shadows between the buildings seemed to stretch and deepen. A figure stepped out of an alleyway, blocking her path. It was one of the deputies who had been with the marshal. "Miss Keene," he said, his hand resting on the butt of his pistol. "The marshal wants another word with you, a private one." A cold dread washed over her. This was not about another word. This was about silencing her. She backed away slowly. "I have nothing more to say to him tonight." "I am afraid you do not have a choice." He took a step toward her. From the other end of the alley, another man appeared. They meant to corner her. Thinking fast, Eliza spun around and darted into the narrow space between the general store and the blacksmith's shop. It was a maze of barrels and discarded crates, thick with the smell of refuse. She could hear them behind her, their heavy boots crunching on the gravel. She ran, her lungs burning, her only thought to get back to the relative safety of her room. She saw an unsteady stack of empty barrels and, without hesitating, shoved them with all her might. They toppled over with a tremendous crash, blocking the alley and giving her the precious seconds she needed. She burst out the other side and did not stop running until she was behind the locked door of her room, her back pressed against the wood, listening to the sound of her own ragged breathing. Later, in the quiet solitude of her room, she took stock of the damage. Her camera was a wreck, but the box, though splintered, was mostly intact. The lens mechanism was salvageable, with parts from her travel clock and a bit of wire from the general store. She might be able to piece it back together. It would be a fragile, ugly thing, but it might work. She would make it work. As she painstakingly began to dismantle the broken pieces, a new, unsettling feeling crept into her heart. She thought of Chasen, sitting in a dark cell, a victim of the very injustice she had come west to document. A confusing warmth spread through her chest when she remembered his fierce, silent defense of her on the road. It was a feeling she had no right to, a dangerous flicker of connection to a man her world had taught her to fear and pity. A soft knock on her door made her jump. She froze, her hands tightening on a small brass screw. "Miss Keene." The voice was a low whisper, coming from the hallway. She held her breath, not daring to answer. "They know you are a danger now," the voice continued. "It was Chasen. This town is not safe for you." She moved to the door, her hands shaking as she slowly turned the key. She opened it a crack. He stood there, no longer in custody, a shadow in the dim hallway. He must have escaped. How she breathed. "The lock was old," he said simply, as if it were the most obvious thing in the world. He looked past her at the disassembled camera parts spread across her table. "They broke your weapon." "I am rebuilding it," she said, a note of defiance in her voice. He nodded slowly, a flicker of something that might have been respect in his eyes. "They want to blame my people for their crimes, to steal our land. I will not let that happen. And I will not let them imprison an innocent man," she said. her voice filled with a conviction that surprised even herself. She held up the Spencer cartridge she had kept. They left a trail. Their eyes met in the dim light, and an unspoken understanding passed between them. They were two different people from two different worlds, but they were united by a common enemy and a shared desire for the truth. "You know how to read the ground," Eliza said, her voice barely above a whisper. "The signs they leave behind." "And you," Jason replied, his gaze returning to the camera parts, "know how to use the light." A pact was formed in that quiet hallway, not with a handshake, but with a simple, shared look. They had to get out of Adobe Crossing. They had to find the men who had attacked her and expose the lie before it took root and poisoned everything. "Tonight," he said. It was not a question. Eliza nodded. Her decision made, she looked at the pieces of her camera, her fragile weapon of truth. It was all she had, that and the help of a man who was supposed to be her enemy. They left under the cover of a moonless sky, two solitary figures slipping out of a sleeping town and into the vast, dangerous wilderness of the Llano. The Llano Estacado was an ocean of grass and sky, a place that swallowed sound and stretched time until a day felt like a week. To be out on it, alone and on foot, was to be a sinner in a vast, silent church. For Eliza, every step was an act of faith. They had fled Adobe Crossing with 2 horses taken from the livery, a canteen of water each, and the hastily bundled, damaged parts of her camera. Jason led the way, not by following a path, for there was none, but by reading the subtle language of the land. He moved with an economy of motion that made her own city-bred stride feel clumsy and wasteful. The first day was a trial by sun. The heat was a physical weight, pressing down, leaching the moisture from her body until her tongue felt thick in her mouth. The wind was no relief. It was a hot breath that chapped her lips and filled her eyes with a persistent, sandy sting. By late afternoon, their canteens were perilously light. Eliza's initial burst of defiant energy had dwindled to a dogged, plodding determination. She focused on the back of the man in front of her, on the steady rhythm of his walk, and tried not to think about the burning in her throat. As the sun began its descent, painting the sky in brutal strokes of orange and purple, Jason stopped. He knelt in a shallow depression where the grass was thin and the ground had a whitish, salty cast. Eliza watched, too tired to ask questions. As he dug into the earth with his obsidian knife, he did not dig deep, but instead scraped away the top layer, his fingers probing the soil. He moved a few feet and did it again. Finally, he seemed to find what he was looking for. He used his hands, scooping out a shallow hole. Slowly, miraculously, a murky, brownish water began to seep into it. "Drink," he said. The word was a quiet command. Eliza knelt beside him, her knees cracking in protest. The water looked uninviting, but the thirst was a raging fire inside her. She cupped her hands and drank. It was cool and earthy, with a faint taste of minerals, but it was the most wonderful thing she had ever tasted. "How did you know?" she asked, her voice raspy. He pointed with his chin toward a scrubby, deep-rooted plant growing nearby. "That one only grows where there is water underneath. You learn to see." She drank again, then watched as he allowed the horses to drink from the shallow pool. It was a lesson in survival, a piece of knowledge that felt more valuable than gold. She realized how utterly dependent she was on him out here. In town, she had her wits and her trade. Out here, she was a child. The thought was both humbling and deeply unsettling. They made a cold camp that night, chewing on dried beef and a piece of hardtack she had stuffed in her pockets. The stars emerged, a brilliant, scattered dust of diamonds against black velvet, more stars than she had ever imagined. The silence was absolute, broken only by the sighing of the wind and the occasional stamp of a horse's hoof. "That is the 3rd time today," Eliza said into the darkness. Jason was sharpening his knife on a smooth stone. He did not look up. "The 3rd time for what?" "The 3rd time you have said more than 3 words in a row." She was trying for levity, for some small piece of the witty banter that came so easily to her back east. Here, the words felt small and foolish against the immense silence. He paused his work. In the faint starlight, she could just make out the shape of his face. A long moment passed, and she thought he would not answer. Then she saw the corner of his mouth twitch. It was not quite a smile, but it was the closest she had seen. "I save my words," he said, his voice a low rumble, "for when I need to shoot." Eliza let out a small, surprised laugh. The sound was a welcome intrusion into the night. It felt good to laugh. She lay back, using her saddle as a pillow, and looked up at the cosmos. Despite the danger, despite the thirst and the fear, a part of her felt more alive than she had in years. The next day, Chasen found the trail. It was not a trail a person like her could ever see. To Eliza, it was just more grass and dust. But he pointed out a bent blade of grama grass, a scuff mark on a stone no bigger than her fist. This was his territory, his language. As they followed the faint signs, he suddenly stopped and bent down, plucking something from the dirt. It was another brass cartridge, a Spencer. He handed it to her without a word. It was a cold, hard confirmation. They were on the right track. An hour later, he found something else caught on a thorny mesquite bush. It was a piece of gray wool, thick and coarse. He held it up. "Army sock," he said. The 3 words landed with the weight of a judge's gavel. So, not just army weapons. Army men, deserters, most likely. Hired guns. And there was only one man in the territory with enough money and enough influence with the army to arrange such a thing, Luther Pike. As Chasen examined the wool, his face hardened. The distant sound of a train whistle, a lonely cry from miles away, drifted on the wind. His eyes grew distant, and Eliza saw a flicker of profound pain in them. An old wound suddenly torn open. She sensed he was no longer seeing the endless grass, but something else, a memory. He was remembering the thunder of the Sharps' rifles, the sound that had echoed across these plains during the great slaughter of the buffalo herds. He was remembering the sight of the fields of carcasses, left to rot under the sun, a whole way of life destroyed for the price of a hide. He had scouted for the soldiers then, led them through this land, never imagining the scale of the devastation they would unleash. The guilt was a shadow that lived inside him, a constant companion. Eliza felt a pang of a similar, though smaller, despair. She reached into her satchel and her fingers closed around a small, sharp object wrapped in cloth. It was the largest remaining shard of the glass plate, the one showing Pike and Brackett. She had picked it up from the dust, an instinctive act of a person refusing to let go of a broken thing. She had believed so fiercely in the power of her camera. One clear image, she thought, could stop a lie in its tracks. But her truth had been shattered into 1,000 pieces. A photograph was nothing without a person willing to look at it, to believe it. Truth was as fragile as glass. She and Chasen were both haunted. She realized, he by a past he could not change, and she by a future she was terrified she could not protect. That night, the land itself seemed to turn against them. They made camp near a series of rocky ledges that offered some protection from the wind. But the darkness was alive with sound. A pack of coyotes began to sing their wild, unnerving song, their yips and howls echoing off the rocks. The horses grew nervous, their ears twitching, their eyes wide in the moonlight. Chasen was calming his mount, speaking to it in low, soft tones of his own language. When Eliza's horse suddenly shied, pulling its reins free from the rock where she had tied them, it bolted into the darkness, cursing her own carelessness. Eliza scrambled after it. She did not want to lose their only means of carrying her heavy equipment. She followed the sound of its panicked retreat along the edge of the rocky shelf. The moonlight was deceptive, creating deep shadows and flattening the terrain. In her haste, her foot came down on a patch of loose scree. The ground simply gave way. She cried out, a short, sharp gasp, as she fell. Her hands scrabbled for purchase, her fingers scraping against raw stone. She was not falling into a deep canyon, but it was a steep, jarring drop of 10 or 12 feet onto more rocks below. But she did not hit the bottom. An iron grip clamped around her wrist, arresting her fall so abruptly it sent a jolt of pain up her arm. It was Chasen. He had moved with the same impossible speed he had shown during the ambush. He was lying flat on the ledge above her, his other hand braced against a rock, his body a taut line of muscle holding her entire weight. "Do not move," he said. The words were a low growl, strained with effort. She hung there, suspended in the darkness, her heart a wild drum against her ribs. She could feel the strength in his hand, a raw, primal power that was both terrifying and incredibly reassuring. He began to pull, slowly, steadily. She found a foothold, scrambling to help, and in a moment that seemed to stretch into an eternity, he hauled her up and over the edge. She collapsed onto the dusty ground, gasping for breath, her body trembling with adrenaline. He knelt beside her, his hand still on her arm, his breathing heavy. "Are you hurt?" "No," she whispered, though she was not entirely sure. "I am all right." Their faces were only inches apart. In the pale moonlight, she could see the fierce intensity in his eyes. The world seemed to shrink to the small space between them, to the feel of his calloused hand on her skin, to the shared sound of their breathing. A current passed between them, a spark of something new and unnamed, born of shared danger and a moment of absolute trust. It was potent and dizzying, and it frightened her more than the fall itself. He seemed to feel it too. He released her arm as if he had been burned and stood up, turning away to retrieve the spooked horse. The rest of the night passed in a charged silence. The next morning, as the first light of dawn washed the color back into the world, Chasen was already awake, scanning the horizon. Eliza noticed an eagle feather tied near the top of his bow. She had not seen it before. It was a single, perfect feather, its edges sharp and clear against the morning sky. It seemed to represent him perfectly, seeing things others missed, a vision that was clear and far-reaching. He led them on, and not an hour after sunrise, they found it, a small campfire, nestled in a hollow out of the wind. Chasen knelt and pressed his palm flat against the ashes. He looked up at her, his eyes dark with meaning, still warm. The impostors were close, very close. He rose and walked a short distance, studying the tracks leading away from the camp. They were clearer here, the ground softer. He stood for a long time, looking north. "Where are they going?" Eliza asked, her voice hushed. He did not turn around. He just pointed. Hidden Spur Ranch, Pike's Land. The final piece of the puzzle clicked into place. It was not just a random band of deserters. They were reporting to their master. Eliza looked in the direction he indicated. The land was vast and empty, but she knew that somewhere out there, under that enormous sky, lay the heart of the conspiracy. There was no turning back now. The law was a lie, and the wilderness was their only ally. "We cannot fight them all," she said, the reality of their situation settling on her. Chasen finally turned to face her. The morning sun caught the sharp planes of his face. "We will not fight," he said. "Not yet. We will watch. We will learn." He glanced at the bundle containing her repaired camera. "And we will find our own way to shoot." He looked back toward the horizon. "We go in at dawn." Hidden Spur Ranch was not a home. It was a declaration of war against the emptiness of the prairie. It sat in a wide, shallow valley, a collection of sturdy buildings, corrals, and a main house built of stone and thick timber. It was a fortress of commerce, surrounded by thousands of acres and tens of thousands of cattle, each one branded with Luther Pike's mark. As dawn broke, painting the eastern sky in pale shades of rose and gray, Eliza and Chasen watched it from a high ridge. The plan they had devised was simple, audacious, and likely to get them both killed. They will be watching for a Comanche warrior. Eliza had reasoned the night before, but they will not be watching for a traveling photographer with an interest in bovine portraiture. Chasen had merely grunted, a sound that could have meant agreement or a profound skepticism in the sanity of her world. Eliza rode down into the valley alone, her back straight, her expression a careful blend of professional confidence and artistic sensitivity. Her patched-together camera was a monstrosity of brass, wood, and wire, but she carried it as if it were a priceless instrument. Chasen, meanwhile, melted into the landscape, a ghost moving toward the ranch from the opposite direction. His target a large hayloft that offered a commanding view of the entire compound. A burly foreman with a sun-cured face and suspicious eyes met Eliza at the main gate. "This is private property, Miss." "Of course it is," Eliza said, her voice bright and clear. "It is the finest property in the Panhandle. From what I hear, that is precisely why I am here. I am Eliza Keene. I have been commissioned by the Texas Stockman's Journal to photograph the most impressive breeding bulls in the territory for a catalog, and everyone says that Mr. Pike's stock is second to none." The foreman's suspicion did not vanish, but it was joined by a flicker of pride. Pike's vanity about his prize bulls was legendary. "The boss ain't here. He is in Adobe Crossing." "What a shame," Eliza said, feigning disappointment. "Still, the light is perfect this morning. Perhaps you would allow me to take a few preliminary plates. I would hate to have wasted the journey." He hesitated, then gave a reluctant nod. As Eliza began to set up her tripod in the main yard, she saw them, the men from the ambush, not in their clumsy disguises, but in the simple garb of ranch hands. They lounged near the bunkhouse, their eyes following her, a cold, reptilian curiosity in their stares. A few of the other cowhands snickered as she worked, their comments low and crude. "Look at the squaw man's gal," one of them muttered, just loud enough for her to hear. She ignored them, her focus absolute, her hands steady as she prepared a wet plate. She could feel Chasen's unseen presence, a silent promise from the hayloft. She knew he heard them too, and she could only imagine the iron control it took for him to remain still, to hold to his own principle, win with proof, not with fists. After an hour of pretending to photograph a particularly surly-looking longhorn, Eliza declared she was parched. "The dust from the road is still in my throat," she said to the foreman. Would it be too much trouble to ask for a glass of water from the main house? It was the opening she needed. The foreman, eager to be rid of her, grunted and led her to the porch of the main house, pointing her toward a water barrel in the kitchen. Once inside, she moved quickly. The house was quiet, the air thick with the smell of leather and cigar smoke. Pike's office was easy to find. It was the largest room, its walls adorned with maps and the mounted heads of animals, and on the far wall, between two towering bookcases, was a heavy iron safe. Her heart pounded. She had expected this to be the most difficult part, but as she drew closer, she saw that the heavy door was not quite shut. It was a testament to Pike's arrogance, his belief in his own untouchable power. She pulled it open. Inside was a neat stack of ledgers, a canvas bag heavy with coins, and a leather portfolio. She lifted the portfolio out, her fingers trembling slightly. She untied the laces and spread the contents on the massive oak desk. It was all there, a detailed map showing the proposed route of the new railroad line, cutting directly through the Numunu's most sacred hunting grounds. There were legal documents, contracts pre-written to reclaim land from settlers in the wake of a prolonged period of native unrest, and at the bottom, a single sheet of paper with a military letterhead. It was a handwritten note from Colonel Brackett to Pike. Its message was brief and damning, confirming payment for services rendered and outlining the next phase of their plan. She did not have time to steal the documents. Her only option was to copy them. She worked with frantic, focused energy, carrying them to the window where the light was best. She set up her camera on the desk. A new plate coated and slipped into the holder. The click of the shutter was the loudest sound in the world. 1 plate, 2, 3. She was just sliding the 3rd plate into its light-proof box when a shadow fell across the doorway. "Finding the accommodations to your liking, Miss Keene." Eliza's blood ran cold. It was Hale, the Pinkerton. He stood there, his hat in his hands, that same thin predatory smile on his face. He sniffed the air. "An interesting perfume," he said, his eyes narrowing. "Ammonia. Collodion. Smells a bit like a photographer's darkroom. You seem to be a long way from the cattle pens." Eliza's mind raced. Panic was a luxury she could not afford. She forced a bright, slightly flustered smile. "Mr. Hale, you startled me. The foreman was kind enough to let me use the office to organize my plates. The dust outside is simply ruinous for the chemical process." She gestured vaguely at the room. "And I must say, Mr. Pike's office is as impressive as his livestock. A man of such power and influence, you must feel very secure working for him. I imagine the security here is formidable." She looked him directly in the eye, turning his suspicion into a backhanded compliment. "I am sure nothing happens on this ranch that you are not aware of." His eyes held hers for a long, tense moment. He was a wolf sniffing for weakness, but Eliza gave him none. Just as the silence became unbearable, a sudden, tremendous crash echoed from the yard, followed by shouting. It was the diversion. From the window, she saw a huge water trough near the bunkhouse collapse, a dark arrow protruding from the splintered wood. Hale swore and spun toward the door. "Stay here," he commanded, and rushed outside. The moment he was gone, Eliza grabbed her plates and ran. She did not look back. The entire ranch was in an uproar. Men were running toward the shattered trough, shouting in confusion. It gave her the cover she needed. She sprinted for the far side of the ranch, toward the low whistle of an approaching freight train on the siding that served Pike's cattle pens. She could hear Hale shouting her name now, the confusion turning to focused rage. A gunshot cracked the air, and a bullet whined past her head. She saw Chasen drop from the roof of the hayloft, landing with a cat-like grace. He was running to meet her. The train was picking up speed, its massive wheels clattering on the iron rails. Now Chasen yelled. He grabbed her arm, and together they ran alongside the moving train. He threw her satchel of plates into an open coal car, then half lifted, half threw her in after it. She landed hard, the breath knocked out of her, the rough coal biting into her skin. A moment later, he vaulted in beside her, just as another volley of bullets slammed into the side of the car. They were pursued. 2 men on horseback were galloping alongside the train, trying to get a clear shot. Chasen pulled a small pistol from his belt, a weapon Eliza had not known he possessed. He did not aim for the men. He aimed for the oil lamps hanging from the station posts they were just beginning to pass. The first lamp shattered, plunging a section of the track into semi-darkness. The second one exploded in a shower of glass and flame, under the cover of the growing dusk and the intermittent pools of darkness. Their pursuers fell back, and the train chugged on, carrying them away from Hidden Spur and into the uncertain twilight. They huddled together in the coal car, the rhythmic clatter of the wheels a comforting, hypnotic sound. The adrenaline began to fade, replaced by a deep, bone-weary exhaustion. They were both filthy, covered in a fine black dust. In the dark, confined space, the barriers between them seemed to dissolve. "They almost had me," Eliza said, her voice small. "If not for you." "You were brave," he said. It was a simple statement, but from him, it felt like the highest praise. She was quiet for a long time, the train rocking beneath them. "I was engaged to be married once," she said, the words coming out in a rush, as if they had been waiting a long time to be spoken. "Back in Philadelphia. He was a good man, a kind man, but he wanted me to put away my camera. He said it was not a suitable occupation for a wife. He wanted me to be an ornament. I think he was afraid of what I might see through that lens." She looked down at her hands, black with coal dust. "I ended the engagement. I told myself it was for my art, for my independence. But the truth is, I think I was the one who was afraid. Afraid of being owned. Afraid of being seen as anything less than what I was. Chasen listened without interrupting. When she was finished, the silence stretched. But it was not an empty silence. It was a space for her words to settle. "When I was a boy," he said, his voice so low she had to strain to hear it over the train, "I wanted to be a great warrior, a protector of the people. But the world changed. The soldiers came. I thought, if I learned their ways, if I scouted for them, I could protect my people from the inside. I showed them the best trails, the hidden water holes. I led them into the heart of our land." He paused, and the weight of his next words was immense, and they used that knowledge to hunt the buffalo. "I listened to their big guns, day after day, until the thunder stopped and there was only silence. I helped them destroy the very thing I swore to protect. That is a thing a man does not forget." She could not see his face in the darkness, but she could feel the raw pain of his confession. They were two fugitives in a dirty railroad car. A woman who had run from a gilded cage and a man who had helped to build his own. The train began to slow as it approached a small, isolated telegraph station. An idea seized Eliza. "Chasen, stop the train." He looked at her, confused, but a small emergency brake lever was nearby, and with a grunt of effort, he pulled it. With a screech of metal on metal, the train shuddered to a halt. "Wait here," she said, and jumped down, running toward the small shack where a single light burned. She burst in, startling the night operator. "Urgent message," she said, pushing him aside and taking the telegraph key. "Press business. For the Santa Fe newspaper." Her fingers flew, translating the contents of Brackett's letter into the frantic, clicking language of Morse code. She had to get the word out, create a record beyond the fragile glass plates. She was halfway through when the key went dead under her hand. The rhythmic clicking from the sounder stopped. "What happened?" she asked the operator. He checked his instruments, his face pale. "Line is dead, ma'am, somewhere between here and the next station. It is cut." A cold dread settled in Eliza's stomach. Brackett's reach extended even here, along the wires. They were truly on their own. She returned to the train, her face grim. She told Chasen what had happened. They could not outrun their enemies, and they could not send word ahead. They sat in silence as the train began to move again. The plates in her satchel felt both priceless and useless. They were proof, yes, but who would believe them? The word of a lone woman and a Comanche fugitive against the combined power of Luther Pike and the United States Army. "It is not enough," she said finally. "The photographs are not enough. They will say they are fakes. Brackett's letter. They will say I wrote it myself. We need more." She looked up at him, her eyes adjusting to the dark. "We need a witness, someone from the inside who will speak the truth." Her mind raced back over the faces at the ranch, the hard, cruel faces of the hired guns, the foreman's blustering loyalty. And then another face, a young cowboy, no more than a boy, who had been tasked with helping her move her equipment. He had not jeered with the others. He had looked at her with a kind of frightened curiosity, and when their eyes met, he had looked away quickly, as if ashamed. He had a smudge of dirt on his cheek, and his hands had trembled slightly. Finch, that was his name. "There was a boy," she said, a new energy in her voice. "A young cowboy at the ranch. His name is Finch. He looked afraid. He looked like he had a conscience." It was a slim hope, a wild gamble, but it was all they had. Their physical proof was not enough. They needed a soul to go with it. They needed a man to stand up and say, "I was there, I saw it." They needed to find Finch. Returning to Adobe Crossing was like walking willingly into a cage you had just escaped. They found Finch not at the ranch, but in town, hiding in the livery stable, his face pale with a mixture of fear and resolve. It had been Chasen's tracking that led them to him, but it was Eliza's quiet words that convinced him. She did not threaten or cajole. She simply told him that some truths were heavier to carry in silence than to speak aloud. The news of their return spread through the town like a virus. Before they could fully form a plan, Luther Pike forced their hand. He demanded a preliminary hearing, a swift piece of legal theater designed to brand Chasen an escaped fugitive and Eliza an accomplice, thereby neutralizing them and any evidence they might possess. The venue was the Sage Hen Saloon, the largest room in town, and the man presiding was Judge Albright, a man whose legal opinions were known to be as flexible as the currency Pike paid him with. The saloon was packed. It felt as if the entire population of Adobe Crossing had crammed inside, their bodies generating a suffocating heat that mingled with the stale smell of whiskey and sawdust. A clear line had been drawn down the middle of the room. On one side stood Pike's men, the merchants who depended on his business, and the self-styled respectable citizens, their faces hard with judgment. On the other side was a quieter, more varied crowd Mexican families who had worked this land for generations, a few silent numunu who had come in from the plains, the town's blacksmith, and a scattering of poor cowboys who had felt Pike's boot on their own necks. It was a visual representation of the town's fractured soul. Judge Albright sat behind a makeshift bench, a poker table wiped clean for the occasion. He was a small, sweating man with a thin veneer of judicial gravity. "This is not a trial," he announced, his voice straining to be heard over the murmur. "This is an inquiry into the flight from Justice of the Comanche known as Chasen, and the complicity of one Miss Eliza Keene. Marshal, state the facts." Marshal Thompson lumbered forward, reciting a bland, official version of events that painted Chasen as the aggressor and Eliza as a deluded woman. When he was finished, Eliza stepped forward, her satchel in her hand. "Judge Albright, the marshal's facts are a fiction. I have proof." From her satchel, she carefully produced the 3 glass plates, each wrapped in dark cloth. She had managed to develop them in the dead of night, using a makeshift dark room in a deserted homesteader's cabin. The images were not perfect, but they were clear. She held the first one up to the light from the grimy window. It was the map. "This is a photograph of a map from Luther Pike's office," she declared, her voice ringing with clarity. "A map showing a railroad line that will run directly through land protected by treaty." A low growl went through Pike's side of the room. Pike's lawyer, a slick man from back east, scoffed. "A child's drawing. It proves nothing." Eliza ignored him and held up the second plate. "And this is a photograph of a contract, also from Mr. Pike's safe, outlining the legal seizure of property following a period of manufactured native unrest." "Manufactured," the lawyer sneered. "The woman is a fantasist. Judge, she could have written that herself on a piece of paper and photographed it." "And I suppose I wrote this as well." Eliza's voice was ice. She held up the final plate, the image of Colonel Brackett's handwritten letter. "This is a note from a United States Army colonel, confirming payment for services rendered. It is proof of a conspiracy to incite violence for profit." The accusation hung in the air, heavy and poisonous. Judge Albright fidgeted. "Photographs can be manipulated. Miss Keene, tricks of light and shadow. Without the original documents, these are nothing more than curiosities." "Then perhaps you will accept a human curiosity," a voice said from the back of the room. The crowd parted, standing in the doorway, his thin frame trembling but his eyes wide and determined, was the young cowboy, Finch. He clutched his hat in his hands, twisting the brim. All eyes turned to him. "What is the meaning of this?" the judge sputtered. Finch walked slowly toward the poker table, his boots scuffing on the floorboards. He did not look at Pike or his lawyer. He looked at Eliza, and she gave him a small, encouraging nod. "My name is Tom Finch," he said, his voice cracking. "I ride for Mr. Pike. I was there when they planned it, not just the mail wagon attack, all of it." He took a deep, shuddering breath. "It was Colonel Brackett. He came to the ranch. He hired some of the boys, Army deserters mostly. He gave them the paint and the feathers. He told them to make it look like a Comanche raid. He said it was for the good of the territory, to clear the way for the railroad. A wave of shock and anger rolled through the saloon. Hale, the Pinkerton, who had been standing silently near the wall, suddenly pushed forward. The boy is lying. He is a disgruntled employee, probably paid by this woman. Finch flinched, but he held his ground. I am not lying. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, folded piece of cloth. It was a simple cotton handkerchief, but it was marked in the corner with stenciled black ink U.S. Army. The colonel. He gets nervous. He sweats. He was wiping his face with this, and he dropped it by the bunkhouse. I picked it up. He placed it on the table. That is my proof. The simple, damning piece of evidence lay on the table for all to see. It was the link, the tangible connection that Eliza's photographs needed. The room erupted. Hale saw his carefully constructed lie crumbling. With a snarl of rage, he lunged for Finch. I will shut your mouth for you, you little traitor. He never reached him. There was no sound, just a sudden, vicious thwip that cut through the noise. Every head turned. Hale was frozen in place, his eyes wide with shock. An arrow had appeared as if from nowhere, pinning the brim of his bowler hat to the wooden doorframe behind him. He was trapped, attached to the wall by a single, quivering shaft of wood and feather. Standing near the opposite wall, his bow held loosely in his hand, was Chasen. He had been there the whole time, a silent, watchful presence that most had overlooked. He had not drawn the bow to his ear. He had snapped off the shot from his hip. A feat of instinctive, lethal accuracy. Hale stared, speechless, at the man he had helped imprison. Chasen's expression was as dry as the dust outside. Do not move, he said, his voice quiet but carrying to every corner of the room. The west wind is helping me aim. The moment was a spark on dry tinder. The tension in the room exploded. The Mexican vaqueros moved to stand with Finch. The blacksmith picked up a heavy wooden mallet from a nearby toolbox. On the other side, Pike's men put their hands on their pistols. The saloon had become a powder keg, and Chasen's arrow had just lit the fuse. And then, the world outside went dark. A low moan began to build, a sound that started in the distance and grew into a deafening roar. The light coming through the windows turned a sickly yellow-brown. The wind hit the saloon like a physical blow, rattling the doors and shaking the very foundations of the building. A dust storm, one of the great, terrible furies of the Llano, was upon them. Sand and grit began to force their way through the cracks in the walls, filling the air with a choking haze. Men cursed and shielded their faces. The organized lines of conflict dissolved into a chaotic scramble for cover. In the swirling confusion, Eliza saw a figure appear at the saloon's back door. It was Colonel Brackett, his face a mask of cold fury, a pistol in his hand. He moved with military precision, grabbing Hale by the collar and using a knife to cut the arrow shaft, freeing his hat and his man. They disappeared into the blinding, screaming storm before anyone could stop them. The hearing was over, ended not by law but by weather. The crowd dispersed, hunched against the wind, each person returning to their own small shelter, the great questions of guilt and innocence left hanging in the dusty air. Later, as the storm raged outside, Eliza and Chasen found refuge in the livery stable. The wind howled through the slats in the walls, and the air was thick with the smell of hay and nervous animals. I am sorry, Eliza said, her voice barely audible over the gale. I brought you back into this. I put you in front of their guns. If that arrow... You did not... He cut her off. I chose to stand. You chose to bring the truth to them. He looked out into the swirling brown maelstrom. My whole life, I have seen my people pushed back, our words ignored, our lives treated as less than nothing. He paused, and when he spoke again, his voice was heavy with the weight of his past. When I scouted for the army, I stood by and watched. I did nothing. I let the herds be slaughtered. I abandoned the land to them. I thought I was surviving, but I was just letting things die." He turned to look at her, his eyes dark and intense. "My greatest fear is not a bullet. It is abandoning something again. It is standing by while the world is burned down." As if summoned by his words, the stable door burst open and Finch stumbled in, gasping, his face covered in dust. "They are gone," he panted. "Brackett and Hale. But I heard them. Before they left." "They are not running." He looked from Eliza to Chasen, his young face etched with a new and terrible urgency. "They are going to Red Mesa." Pike said if he cannot have the land, no one can. "They are taking explosives from the railroad camp. They are going to burn the hunting grounds, create a fire so big it will look like the whole territory is at war. They want to destroy the last of the buffalo herd." The howling of the wind was the only sound for a long moment. Red Mesa, the sacred heart of the Numunu hunting grounds. It was not a retreat. It was an escalation, a final, scorched earth act of spite and greed. They had won the battle in the saloon, but they were about to lose the war on the plains. They had to get there first. The dust storm that had saved them had also blinded them, a raging temporary truce imposed by nature. Under its cover, they moved, not toward safety, but toward the source of the danger. Finch's words had changed everything. This was no longer just about exposing a crime. It was about preventing a massacre, not of people, but of the land itself, and the last vestiges of the life it supported. Their destination was a remote supply depot for the railroad, a cluster of sheds and a water tower miles from any real settlement. It was where the explosives, the dynamite and blasting powder for cutting through hillsides, were stored under a lock and key. Brackett's men would have to go there first. Eliza and Chasen's only hope was to intercept the vanguard, the small group sent ahead to secure the materials. They found the depot nestled in a rocky canyon, the air still hazy with the aftermath of the storm. 3 men were there, deserters by the look of their mismatched gear and sullen watchfulness. They were not expecting trouble. They were the trouble, and they believed their isolation was their protection. The attack was a thing of brutal and silent efficiency. Chasen moved through the rocks like a hunting cat, a phantom of the twilight. Eliza's role was a simple, terrifying one. She took one of the horses and, staying out of rifle range, created a commotion on the far side of the camp, a diversion that drew the attention of 2 of the guards. It gave Chasen the opening he needed. She heard no war cry, only the soft thrum of a bowstring and a choked cry. When she circled back, 2 of the men were down, incapacitated with arrows placed with surgical precision in their thighs and shoulders. The 3rd man, the sentry, was turning, raising his rifle, his face a mask of surprise. Chasen was on him before he could fire, a blur of motion that ended with the man on the ground. The wind knocked out of him. But the man was desperate. As he fell, his fingers spasmed on the trigger. The rifle discharged. A flat, deafening crack in the canyon's quiet. The bullet, fired wild, ricocheted off a nearby boulder. Chasen cried out, a sharp intake of breath, and stumbled back a step. Eliza's heart leaped into her throat. She slid from her horse and ran to him as he disarmed the last man and bound the 3 of them securely. "You are hit," she said, her voice tight with fear. "It is nothing," he grunted, but she saw him favor his left side, and a dark stain was already beginning to spread on his buckskin shirt, just above his hip. A piece of the rock, or the bullet. A graze. "A graze that is bleeding through your shirt," she countered. "We need to clean it. We need water." He nodded, his jaw tight against the pain. They could not stay. The main force would be coming. He took a moment to slash open powder kegs, rendering them useless, before they gathered their horses and rode hard for the one place that offered both concealment and life. The Canadian River. They reached its banks as the sun was setting, turning the wide, slow-moving water into a sheet of molten copper. The air grew cool. smelling of damp earth and the sweet, resinous scent of cottonwood leaves. They found a secluded spot, a small sandy cove sheltered by a thicket of willows, and Chasen finally allowed himself to sit, leaning his back against the smooth trunk of an ancient tree. He pulled the torn shirt away from the wound. It was a long, ugly gash, furrowed and raw, bleeding sluggishly. It was not deep, but it was filled with dust and fragments of his clothing. Eliza knelt in front of him, her medical knowledge limited to what she had read in books and the practical necessities of a life far from any doctor. She tore a strip from her cleanest petticoat and dipped it in the river, the water shockingly cold.
"This will hurt,"
she said softly. "I have felt worse," he replied, his voice a low rasp. He stared out at the river, his profile stoic against the dying light, but she saw the tightening of the muscles in his jaw as she began to clean the wound. Her touch was surprisingly steady, her hands moving with a delicate, focused purpose. She worked in silence, concentrating on the task, on cleaning away the grit and blood. As she worked, her fingers brushed against his skin, warm and alive beneath the layers of trail dust. She felt the hard ridges of old scars, a geography of his past written on his body, telling stories of battles she could only imagine. These were not the wounds of a villain, but the marks of a survivor, a protector. The last of the sun's rays slanted through the willows, catching the moisture on his skin. He had borne her ministration without a sound, his breathing the only sign of his pain. When she finally finished, dabbing the wound as dry as she could, he let out a long, slow breath and turned his head to look at her. A smile, faint and brief but genuine, touched his lips. It was a smile of gratitude, of trust, and it transformed his entire face, softening the harsh lines carved by years of hardship and suspicion. It was a smile meant only for her. The commander's skin gleamed, she ached inside as his smile claimed only her. The thought, unbidden and overwhelming, filled her mind. The ache was a sharp, sweet pain in her chest, a recognition of the profound and impossible connection that had grown between them in the heart of this violent land. He saw the change in her eyes, the sudden vulnerability. The smile faded, replaced by a look of searching intensity. "Eliza," he said, his voice quiet. He had never used her first name before. It sounded strange and beautiful in his mouth. "You should not have taken the risk," she whispered, her hand still resting on the edge of the bandage she had fashioned. "For me." "It was not just for you," he said. "It was for the truth you carry. But yes, it was also for you." The confession hung in the air between them, as real and tangible as the river flowing past. They were from different worlds. A woman of light and letters and a man of earth and shadow. Everything in their society, in their history, was designed to keep them apart. Yet here, in this quiet cove, none of that mattered. All that mattered was the shared danger, the shared purpose, and this fragile, powerful feeling that had taken root in the driest of soils. She reached up and gently touched his face, her thumb tracing the line of his cheekbone. He did not pull away. He closed his eyes for a moment, leaning into her touch as if it were an anchor in a storm. "Chasen," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "I do not know what this is. I do not know what we are supposed to do with it." He opened his eyes. They were dark pools, reflecting the last light of the sky. "We survive," he said simply, "and we see what is on the other side of the river." He placed his hand over hers, his fingers warm and strong. "We will go slowly, with respect." It was a promise, a pact to honor the boundaries between their worlds even as they crossed them. Leaning forward, she closed the small distance between them and pressed her lips to his. It was not a kiss of passion, but of recognition. It was short and real, tasting of dust and water and a shared, desperate hope. It was a kiss as honest as the land itself. When they parted, the last of the light was gone, and the world was bathed in the soft, silver glow of the rising moon. Eliza took the blue silk scarf from her neck, the one piece of civilized softness she had left. She folded it into a narrow band and, taking his uninjured hand, tied it gently around his wrist.
"So you will remember to come back,"
she said, her voice a little unsteady. He looked at the scrap of blue against his dark skin. Then he reached for the small leather pouch at his belt. From it, he took a small, flat flake of black obsidian. It was razor sharp, a sliver of volcanic glass that caught the moonlight like a trapped piece of the night sky. He pressed it into her palm. "So you can cut through all the lies," he said. She closed her fingers around it, the sharp edges a reminder of the dangerous world they still had to face. This exchange felt more binding than any formal vow. They had a new plan now, born of this quiet moment. It was not enough to stop Pike's men. They had to expose the entire conspiracy, to send the truth out so far and so wide it could not be silenced. "The photographs," she said, her mind clearing, her focus returning. "Finch can get them to the marshal in Amarillo. And a copy of my Morse code message. It will be my word and his against Pike's. But with the pictures, it might be enough to bring real law here. And while the law travels," Chasen said, his hand resting on his bow, "we will free the hunting grounds." A measure of their old dynamic returned, a comfortable ease settling over the new intimacy. "You know," Eliza said, a faint smile playing on her lips, "if we survive this, I will need to take a proper photograph of you, a portrait of the man who saved my life." She tilted her head, studying him like a subject. "But you will have to learn to smile with your eyes. It is the secret to a good portrait." He considered this with the same seriousness he gave to tracking a deer. "I will try," he said, his expression completely straight, "when there are no more arrows flying past my head." The quiet moment was broken by the sound of a single horse approaching at a cautious walk. They were both on their feet in an instant. Chasen's bow in his hand. Eliza's obsidian flake clutched tight. But it was Finch, his young face pale and drawn in the moonlight. He had news, and it was not good. "I got word from a friend who is still at the ranch. He said, breathless, Pike and Brackett are moving faster than we thought. They are not waiting. They have a new plan. They are going to use the main blasting charges from the railroad pass. They are going to plant them at the base of the cliffs at Red Mesa and bring the whole thing down. Seal the valley forever." He looked at Chasen, his eyes wide with urgency. "It is happening on the night of the next full moon. That is 2 days from now." Finch's news fell upon them like a shroud, chilling the small warmth that had grown between Eliza and Chasen by the river. 2 days. It was an impossible timeline. A frantic race against a lit fuse. They could not stop Pike's men alone. The truth, captured on her glass plates, was a weapon for the future, for courtrooms and newspapers, but Red Mesa needed a defense for the present, a shield of flesh and blood. The first journey was Chasen's. He rode into the heart of the Llano, to the hidden encampment where the last of his New Munu band had made their winter home. He returned not with an army, but with a dozen warriors, their faces a mixture of grim resolve and deep suspicion. They were hard men, their trust shattered by a lifetime of broken treaties and casual betrayals. Their leader, an old warrior named Stone Hoof, looked at Eliza as if she were a ghost, a pale harbinger of the very world that sought to destroy them. They gathered in a sheltered draw as the cold night wind began to rise, their small fire a defiant spark against the encroaching darkness. Chasen spoke to them in the fluid, rhythmic cadence of their own tongue, his words painting a picture of Pike's greed and Brackett's treachery. He spoke of the fake raids, the stolen land, and the final, terrible plan to obliterate Red Mesa. The men listened, their faces impassive, their dark eyes fixed on him. When he was finished, Stonehoof's gaze fell again on Eliza. "And her," the old man asked, the words in his language sharp and questioning. "The white woman. She holds a box that steals the spirit. Why is she here?" A few of the other warriors murmured in agreement. Their suspicion was a wall between them, thick and high. Eliza felt a familiar sting of being the outsider, the interloper. She stood her ground, her chin held high, but she remained silent. This was Chasen's battle to fight. Chasen stepped forward, placing himself between her and the council of warriors. "Her box does not steal spirits," he said, his voice firm and clear. "It captures truth. It traps lies in a cage of light. I have seen it. She could have fled. She could have saved herself. Instead, she came back to fight a battle that was not hers." He looked around the circle, meeting each man's eye. "Their weapons are fire and dynamite. Ours are the bow, the horse, and the land itself. But she has a weapon they do not understand, and they fear it." He paused, his gaze resting on Stonehoof with unwavering respect. "She fights with light." The words settled into the silence. The old warrior studied Eliza for a long moment, his ancient eyes weighing her soul. Finally, he gave a slow, deliberate nod. The wall of suspicion had not vanished, but a gate had been opened. While Chasen gathered the warriors, Eliza and Finch rode back toward Adobe Crossing, a desperate mission of their own. They did not go into town, but to the outskirts, to the people who lived on the fringes, those who had the most to lose from Pike's iron-fisted rule. Their first stop was the cantina run by Doña Isabella, a formidable woman with silver threaded through her black hair and wisdom in her dark, knowing eyes. She listened to Eliza's story without interruption, her hands busy polishing a glass. When Eliza was finished, Isabella set the glass down with a decisive click. "Luther Pike," she said, the name a curse on her lips. "He thinks because he owns the cattle. He owns the grass. Because he owns the bank. He owns the town. He is a sickness. What do you need?" "People," Eliza said simply, "and guns." Isabella nodded. She sent a boy to fetch the Mexican vaqueros who worked the small, independent ranches that Pike was slowly squeezing into oblivion. She also sent for Mr. Cole, the town blacksmith. He was a powerfully built black man, a former slave who had forged a life of quiet dignity for himself with his hammer and his anvil. He arrived carrying a long, heavy shotgun, his face grim. He, more than anyone, knew what it was to live under the thumb of a tyrant. In the back room of the cantina, this unlikely alliance took shape. Comanche warriors, Mexican cowboys, a freed slave, a saloon owner, a runaway youth, and a photographer from Philadelphia. They were the people the world had forgotten, the ones who did not fit into Pike's grand design. The plan they formed was one of desperation and cunning. The main force of warriors and vaqueros would move to cut off the supply wagons bringing the explosives. Chasen would lead a smaller group to stampede a herd of wild mustangs across the main approach to Red Mesa. A thundering, chaotic diversion to sow confusion and delay Brackett's advance. Eliza's role was crucial. She identified 3 key locations on the cliffs overlooking the valley, 3 distinct vantage points. She would move between them, her camera her only weapon, to document the approach of Brackett's men, the placement of the explosives, and the faces of the men doing the work. The truth would be captured from every angle. As night fell over their camp near the foothills of Red Mesa, the wind grew colder, carrying the sharp bite of the high plains. The sky was clear, but in the far distance, a faint, flickering sheet lightning danced along the horizon. A dry storm. No rain, just electricity. Chasen looked at it, his face troubled. A stray bolt of lightning hitting the rocks near the dynamite could set the whole valley ablaze before the fight even began. Nature, it seemed, was as unpredictable as their enemies. Before they separated into their assigned groups, the Numunu gathered around a small, clean burning fire. It was not a war ceremony, but something quieter, more personal. An offering of smoke and a low, chanted prayer for safety, for clarity of sight, for the strength of the land to aid them. Eliza stood at a respectful distance, a silent observer. She thought of her camera, of the instinct to raise it and capture this moment of profound, simple faith. But she resisted. She understood now, with a clarity that went beyond her lens, that some moments were not meant to be recorded. They were meant to be lived, to be held in the memory of a community. To photograph this would be a violation, a theft of something sacred. She was not just a documentarian anymore. She was part of the story, and this moment belonged to them. As the ceremony concluded, Stonehoof approached her. He held out a small, beaded leather pouch. "For courage," he said in his own language, a phrase Chasen had taught her. She accepted it with a grateful nod, the small gesture of acceptance meaning more to her than any spoken praise. Just as the groups were preparing to move out, a frantic rider appeared out of the darkness. It was Finch. He had been scouting the enemy's movements. "It is a trap," he gasped, sliding from his horse. "Hale is not with the main group. He has taken a dozen men. They are moving to secure Scorpion Pass. The only way you can get to the cliffs without being seen. They are planning to ambush you." The news was a cold shock. But Finch was not finished. He pushed his way to the firelight and unrolled a piece of stolen parchment. It was a crude map, drawn by one of Brackett's engineers. "This is where they are planting the charges," he said, his finger tracing a line along the base of the cliffs. "Here, here, and here. They want to create a landslide that will bury the valley entrance forever." He had risked everything to bring them this information, crossing the final line from a frightened observer to an active combatant. Chasen placed a hand on the young man's shoulder, a silent acknowledgement of his bravery. The trap was a complication, but the map was an advantage they could not have hoped for. As they adjusted their plans, a strange, wheezing whistle suddenly echoed through the camp, a sound like a dying steam engine. Everyone jumped, reaching for their weapons. It was Mr. Cole, a triumphant grin on his face, holding a bizarre contraption of brass pipes and a small boiler. "Just a little something I put together," he said proudly. "A bit of steam, a bit of noise. Figured it might spook their horses something fierce when the time is right." Doña Isabella, checking the action on her shotgun, shook her head with a wry smile. "Men and their toys," she said. But she patted the blacksmith on the arm as she walked past, her eyes glinting in the firelight. "Just make sure you point it the right way, Samuel." The small moment of humor broke the tension. They were ready. The plans were made, the risks accepted. They were a strange, patchwork army, united by a common enemy and a shared love for a piece of earth that powerful men wanted to erase from the map. Eliza packed her plates, her hands moving with practiced efficiency. She was no longer just a photographer. She was a soldier in a war of light against darkness. Chasen, his face grim and focused, gave the final orders. The groups began to move out, melting into the shadows, their footfalls silenced by the vast, windy darkness of the prairie. Eliza looked up at the sky. The moon was rising, a perfect cold silver disk climbing above the horizon, illuminating the stark, beautiful silhouette of Red Mesa. The hourglass had been turned. The final confrontation had begun. The moon was a cold silver coin in the black sky, illuminating Red Mesa in a stark, skeletal light. Below, in the valley, Brackett's men moved like termites, planting their charges at the base of the cliffs, their movements efficient and profane. On the high ridges, the Alliance watched and waited, a scattered collection of ghosts ready to defend their world. The night was a held breath. The battle began not with a bang, but with a whisper. Chasen and his small band of warriors slipped down the shadowed side of the canyon, their goal the delicate web of wires and fuses that connected the dynamite charges. Each severed wire was a small victory, a tooth pulled from the jaw of the monster. At the same time, Eliza, with Finch as her guide, raced toward the lonely telegraph station that served the railroad work camps. It was a desperate gamble. As Chasen fought to disarm the immediate threat, she would fight to send an alarm to the wider world. They moved through the darkness, the precious heavy glass plates of her photograph strapped to her back, a fragile cargo of truth. The first shots erupted near Scorpion Pass. Hale and his men, lying in their ambush, were met not by Chasen's warriors, but by Mr. Cole's shotgun and the determined fire of the vaqueros. The narrow pass became a shooting gallery, the crack of rifles echoing off the stone walls. Mr. Cole, using a massive boulder as cover, exchanged shots with Hale. The two men locked in a deadly, personal duel. Doña Isabella, positioned higher up, saw two of Hale's men trying to circle around and get a clear shot at Finch, who was pinned down. Her shotgun boomed twice, the sound a deep-throated roar of righteous anger, and the threat to the boy vanished. In the main valley, Chasen worked his way toward the master detonator box. He was almost there when he came face to face with Colonel Brackett. The officer stood alone, away from his men, watching the proceedings with an air of cold command. The wind whipped at his uniform, and the dust swirled around his boots. He saw Chasen, and a grim smile touched his lips. He drew his pistol. The fight between them was a whirlwind of movement against the chaotic backdrop of the larger battle. A pistol shot, a flash of an obsidian knife. It was a dance of shadows and grit. Two men representing two worlds locked in a struggle for the soul of the land. Miles away, Eliza burst into the telegraph shack, startling the lone operator. "I need the line," she said, her voice leaving no room for argument. As Finch stood guard at the door, she began to tap out the message, her fingers a blur on the key. It was Finch's confession, a detailed account of the conspiracy, signed with his name. Click by frantic click, she sent the story of Pike's greed and Brackett's crimes singing down the wire, a desperate prayer cast into the electric void. Back at the cliffs, she saw her moment. While the main fight raged, a small group of men guarded the primary supply of explosives, a large, canvas-covered wagon parked in a hollow. This was the source, the heart of the destruction, acting on a plan born of pure audacity. Eliza left her horse and scrambled down a steep game trail. She had saved one of her magnesium flares, the powder used to create the flash for her photographs. Under the cover of a massive rock, she lit it. The flare erupted with a blinding, brilliant white light, momentarily turning night into day. The guards by the wagon, startled and blinded, turned toward the light, shouting in alarm. In that brief, crucial window of confusion, a figure slipped from the shadows. It was Eliza. She had learned the basics of the blasting caps from Finch. With trembling fingers, she pulled a small bundle of wires from the main detonator box and rerouted them. Attaching them to a secondary charge meant only to clear rockfalls. It was a desperate, amateur rewiring. She prayed it would work. She scrambled back into the darkness just as the guard's vision began to clear. From his vantage point, Brackett saw the flare. Enraged by the diversion and the resilience of his opponents, he gave the order, "Now blow it now." The man at the detonator plunger slammed his hand down. There was a tremendous, oddly muffled boom. But the cliffs of Red Mesa did not crumble. The valley did not collapse. Instead, the wagon full of explosives erupted. A contained but powerful blast that sent a column of fire and smoke straight up into the night sky. The force of it threw the nearby guards to the ground. The Alliance's main threat had just destroyed itself. For a single, stunning second, the fireball illuminated the entire scene, and in that second, it caught the faces of Colonel Brackett and Luther Pike, who had just ridden up to witness his triumph. They were frozen in a tableau of disbelief and fury, their features lit as clearly as if they were on a stage. High on a ridge opposite them, there was a second, smaller flash of light, followed by the distinct, sharp click of a camera shutter. Eliza had her picture. The sight of his plan literally blowing up in his face broke Brackett's cold composure. With a roar of pure rage, he drew his cavalry saber, the polished steel a wicked gleam in the moonlight, and charged at Chasen. The duel was a thing of savage grace, the long, heavy saber against the short, wicked blade of obsidian. Brackett fought with the rigid training of a soldier, his cuts and thrusts precise and deadly. Chasen moved like water, flowing around the attacks, his small knife a blur, turning aside the heavier weapon, seeking an opening. He was not trying to kill, he was trying to disarm. To end the fight without ending a life, he caught the saber on his knife, twisting it with a violent wrench of his wrist that sent a shock of pain up Brackett's arm, and the sword clattered to the ground. Before the officer could recover, Chasen was on him. The flat of his blade pressed against Brackett's throat. The fight was over. He tied the colonel's hands with a strip of leather, leaving him defeated but alive. It was then that they heard it, the sound of dozens of riders approaching. Not the rest of Brackett's men, but a posse from Adobe Crossing. The telegraph message had reached a neighboring town, and the news had been relayed. That, combined with the sight of the massive explosion in the direction of Red Mesa, had finally spurred the townspeople and the marshal into action. They rode into the valley, their lanterns bobbing in the dark, a tide of public will that Pike could not buy or intimidate. Seeing them, seeing Brackett on the ground and his own men in disarray, Pike's face went pale. He was surrounded, his power broken, his crimes laid bare under the moonlight. But the chaos was not quite over. In a final, desperate act, Hale, his face bloody from a graze by one of Mr. Cole's shotgun pellets, scrambled from the rocks. He grabbed the nearest person he could find. It was Eliza, who was reloading a plate holder. He put a pistol to her head. "Everybody back," he screamed, his voice raw with panic. "Or the woman dies." Eliza stood perfectly still, the cold metal of the gun pressed against her temple. She looked at Hale, at his wild, terrified eyes, and she felt not fear, but a cold, clear anger. She had not come this far to be a victim. In her free hand, she still held a spare lens for her camera, a thick, heavy piece of polished glass. In a single, fluid motion, she drove her elbow back into Hale's ribs and spun, smashing the heavy lens into his face with all her strength. There was a sickening crunch of glass and bone. Hale screamed, staggering back, his hands flying to his ruined face. His pistol fired harmlessly into the air, and he collapsed to the ground, moaning. An artist, Eliza thought with a strange sense of detachment, also knew how to fight up close. As if the final gunshot were a signal, the world changed. The first drop of rain struck her cheek, cold and startling, then another and another. A sudden, unseasonal downpour began to fall, hissing on the hot rifle barrels, turning the dust to mud, and washing the blood from the stones. The sky wept, a gentle, cleansing rain that extinguished the last embers of the fire and settled over the valley like a benediction. Nature had chosen a side. The fight was over. In the quiet, rain-soaked aftermath, Chasen walked toward her. He stopped a few feet away, his face streaked with dirt, his expression unreadable except for his eyes. They found hers across the small distance, and in them, she saw a universe of relief, of exhaustion, and of a shared, hard-won victory. As they had promised, they smiled with their eyes. Nearby, Finch, who had survived the battle unscathed, leaned against a rock, slid to the ground, and buried his face in his hands. His shoulders shook with great, racking sobs. They were not tears of sorrow, but of release, the overwhelming, cleansing tears of a man who had faced his own fear and found himself, for the first time in his life, weightless and free. The rain that had washed the gunpowder from the air also seemed to wash the slate clean. The arrival of the posse from Adobe Crossing, followed shortly by a federal marshal dispatched from Amarillo, broke the fever of lawlessness that had gripped the territory. The legal proceedings that followed were nothing like the farce that had taken place in the Sage Hen Saloon. A new judge, a stern, unflappable man named Elias Thorne, was sent to preside over a grand jury. He did not use a poker table for a bench. The trial, held in the town's small but proper courthouse, became the story of the territory. It was not a battle of rhetoric, but a careful assembly of facts. Eliza's photographs were entered as evidence. The sharp, clear images of the map, the contracts, and the incriminating letter from Brackett passing from one juror's hand to the next. The telegraph operator from the remote station presented his logbook. The frantic Morse code message of Finch's confession, a permanent, undeniable record. And then Finch himself took the stand. He was no longer the frightened boy from the livery stable. He spoke with a quiet, unwavering voice. His testimony a simple, damning recitation of the truth that linked every piece of evidence together. The verdicts were swift and decisive. Luther Pike, stripped of his power and influence, was found guilty of embezzlement, conspiracy, and inciting a riot. His empire of greed crumbled into dust. Colonel Brackett was handed over to the army for a court-martial that would see him stripped of his rank and sent to a military prison. And Hale, the Pinkerton agent, his face a ruined mask of bandages, was sentenced to a long term in a federal penitentiary for attempted murder. The reign of the pocket judge and the hired gun was over. But the most profound justice was not handed down by a judge. It was forged by the community itself. In a series of meetings held in Doña Isabella's cantina, a revolutionary idea took shape. Red Mesa and its surrounding grasslands would not be sold off or given away. Instead, it would be placed into a public trust, a common ground for all the people of the region. The Red Mesa Grasslands Trust was established, to be managed by a council composed of the Numunu elders, including Stone Hoof and elected representatives from the town, among them Doña Isabella and Mr. Cole. For the first time, the land would belong not to the most powerful, but to everyone. The healing of the town was a slow, quiet process. One afternoon, Eliza set up her camera in the main street and took a photograph not of a hero, but of a community. She gathered them all the Numunu warriors standing beside the Mexican vaqueros. Mr. Cole with his family, Finch looking awkward but proud, Doña Isabella with her arms crossed, and Marshal Thompson looking uncharacteristically humbled. It was a portrait of the strange, resilient alliance that had saved them all. She made a large print and presented it to Isabella, who hung it in the place of honor behind the bar, replacing an old, faded painting of a famous gunfighter. It was a silent declaration that the town's strength lay not in a single man with a fast gun, but in the collective courage of its people. True to her word, she kept the plate of the Numunu ceremony wrapped in dark cloth, a private memory she would never share or sell. The wounds of the past began to heal in other, more private ways. One evening, Eliza found Chasen sitting by the Canadian River, beneath the great cottonwood that had become their meeting place. He was holding his obsidian knife, turning it over and over in his hands, the black stone catching the last of the sun's light. It was the tool of his ancestors, but it was also a symbol of the part of his past that haunted him, the time he had served as a scout. Without a word, he stood up and walked to the small wooden chest where Eliza stored her most delicate photographic supplies. He opened the lid and carefully placed the knife inside, laying it to rest on a bed of soft velvet. He closed the lid, the soft click of the latch a sound of finality. It was not a rejection of his heritage, but an acceptance of his own peace. He was no longer a man defined by the guilt of what he had done, but by the good he had chosen to do. Later that week, Eliza sat at a small desk in her room, a pen and paper in front of her. She was writing a letter to her family in Philadelphia, the first she had written in months. She told them of the dust, the wind, and the violence, but she also told them of the courage she had witnessed, of the community that had been forged in fire, and of the man who had shown her the meaning of home. "I came west to find a place on a map," she wrote, the words flowing freely from her heart. "But I have found that home is not a place at all. It is a person, and I have found mine." Life began to settle into a new rhythm, one of peace and purpose. The air of suspicion that had once choked Adobe Crossing was slowly clearing. One afternoon, as Eliza was sketching plans for a small building that could serve as both a darkroom and a telegraph office. Doña Isabella stopped by. She looked at the plans, a twinkle in her eye. "This is a fine thing, Mia," she said, "a place for truth to be sent and seen. But it will need a proper sign." She pretended to study the empty space above the door in Eliza's drawing. "I am thinking keen and light photographic studio and telegraph." And underneath, in smaller letters, "Proprietors the Light Wrangler and the Arrow Man." Eliza laughed, a full, happy sound. Chasen, who had been quietly mending a bridle nearby, looked up. He did not say a word, but a slow, dark blush crept up from his collar, coloring his ears a deep red. The idea for the shared studio had been a natural one. The town needed a permanent link to the outside world, and it needed someone to record its new history. Eliza would provide both. Chasen, too, found a new role. He had no desire to be a warrior in a time of peace. Instead, he began to teach the children of the town, Numunu, Mexican, and white alike, how to ride, how to read the signs of the land, how to understand the world beyond their fences. He was not teaching them to fight, but to see, to belong to the land instead of just living on it. One evening, as the sun was setting, he and Eliza were walking along the riverbank. They stopped beneath the sprawling branches of their cottonwood tree. The air was cool and quiet, the only sound the gentle murmur of the water and the rustle of the leaves. Chasen was uncharacteristically quiet, his hands shoved into his pockets, his gaze fixed on the far bank. "Eliza," he said finally, his voice a little rough. He turned to face her, and she saw in his eyes a vulnerability that touched her to the core. He looked like a man about to walk into an ambush without a weapon. He took a deep breath. "This town is your home now. If you want it, my people are safe. The land is healing." He gestured vaguely at the earth around them. "There is good soil here. For a house, for other things." He seemed to be struggling, the simple words of his heart, a foreign language on his tongue. He finally met her eyes, his own filled with a fierce, tender honesty. "If you want," he said, the words coming out in a rush of clumsy sincerity. "We can plant a garden tomorrow." It was the most beautiful proposal she had ever heard. Their wedding was not an occasion of bells and lace, but of wind and water and the deep, abiding strength of a cottonwood tree. They stood on the bank of the Canadian River, in the same secluded cove where she had tended his wound, the place where their unspoken feelings had finally found a voice. The entire improbable community of Adobe Crossing was there, a patchwork quilt of humanity standing together under the vast Texas sky. The town's young preacher, a man with a kind face and a slightly worn Bible, stood on one side of them. On the other stood Stone Hoof, his weathered face as serene as the ancient land itself. Two ceremonies, two traditions, were woven into one. The preacher spoke of devotion and partnership, his familiar words a comforting murmur against the sound of the river. When he was finished, Stonehoof stepped forward. He did not speak in English, but in the language of the Numunu, his voice a low, resonant chant that spoke of the earth and the sky, of two paths becoming one trail. He held a long, narrow strip of blue cloth. It was Eliza's silk scarf, the one she had tied around Chasen's wrist. Now, the old warrior took Chasen's hand and then Eliza's, and with a slow, deliberate motion, he wrapped the scarf around both of their wrists, binding them gently together. It was not a chain, but a promise, a soft, bright thread connecting two very different lives. Their future began the next day, with the raising of a small, sturdy building on a piece of land not far from the river. It was a simple structure of pine and adobe, with one large window facing north for the soft, steady light a photographer craves. A sign, hand-painted by Eliza herself, was hung above the door, in elegant script. It read, "Keen and light," and underneath, a line of smaller, more practical letters, "Photographic Studio and Telegraph Office." It was a place for capturing moments and for sending them out into the world, a nexus of light and information. Inside, the space was divided. One side was the studio, with its heavy camera, its backdrops, and the faint, sharp smell of chemicals. In a small wooden display case against one wall, resting on a piece of black velvet, lay a single, sharp-edged obsidian knife, no longer a weapon or a burden, but a piece of history, a reminder of a cycle of violence that had been broken. The other side of the room housed the telegraph key, its brass arm gleaming. Its steady, rhythmic clicking became a new heartbeat for the town, a connection to the world beyond the horizon, a sound of progress that was not threatening, but hopeful. The garden they had spoken of began to take shape behind the new building. Chasen, with the help of some of the Numunu women, showed Eliza how to plant corn and squash and beans, the three sister crops that sustained a people. They worked the rich river-bottom soil with their hands, turning the earth, planting the seeds of their new life together. Watching the first green shoots push their way up into the sunlight felt like a miracle, a quiet testament to the resilience of life. Hope, Eliza learned, was not a grand pronouncement, but a tiny, stubborn thing that grew in the dirt after a cleansing rain. Their own lives had grown and changed in much the same way. Eliza, who had come west to be a detached observer, a person who recorded events through a lens, had become a creator of events, a vital part of the community's fabric. She had not just captured the truth, she had fought for it, bled for it, and helped build a new one. Her camera was still her tool, but her purpose was no longer simply to see, but to help others see as well. Chasen's transformation was quieter, but just as profound. The shadow of guilt that had followed him for so long had finally receded, burned away by the light of his own brave choices. He was no longer the haunted scout, the victim of a history he could not control. He had become a guardian. He taught the town's children, a mixed group of laughing, boisterous youngsters, the lessons of the land. He taught them to ride not with force, but with balance, to track not for a kill, but for understanding, to see the world not as a thing to be conquered, but as a home to be cherished. He was a preserver of life, of law, and of the fierce, quiet love that had anchored his soul. Their love was a thing built of shared moments and quiet understanding. It was in the way he would bring her a cup of coffee as she worked in the dark room. His presence a comforting warmth in the chemical-scented dimness. It was in the way she would watch him from the studio window as he showed a small child how to read the tracks of a coyote, his patience as vast as the plains. Love, they discovered, was not a single, dramatic event. It was a daily choice, a constant, quiet act of planting and tending and trusting in the growth to come. One morning, a customer came to the studio, a young ranching family wanting their first formal portrait. As Eliza arranged them, she saw Chasen watching from the doorway. He caught her eye, and a slow, teasing smile spread across his face, a smile that reached all the way to his eyes. She smiled back, her heart full. Later that day, she painted a smaller, secondary sign to hang beneath the main one. In playful, looping letters, it read, "Smiling with your eyes is free. A photograph costs extra." The land itself seemed to be healing alongside its people. The ugly scars of the attempted mining and the fire were slowly being covered by new grass. And one clear, cool morning, from the ridge overlooking Red Mesa, Chasen and Eliza saw a sight that made them both hold their breath. A small, dark smudge on the horizon, slowly moving, slowly growing. A herd of buffalo. It was not the great thundering river of life from the old stories, but a small, tentative stream returning to its ancestral home. It was enough. The sounds of their life became a kind of music, the sharp click and whir of the camera shutter, the gentle laughter of children learning to ride, and the persistent, hopeful chatter of the telegraph key. tapping out messages of births and business and simple, everyday news. It was the sound of a lasting peace. Eliza stood on the porch of their small home, her hand resting on Chasen's arm, and looked out at the world they had helped to build. The wind still blew across the Llano, a wild and lonely sound, but it no longer felt like a threat. It was just the breath of the land. In a land where the wind howled, she thought. We chose to speak with light. He squeezed her hand, and together they turned and walked into the dark room, stepping out of the bright sun and into the quiet, creative space where new images and a new future were brought to life.
Thank you for listening to our story. We would love to hear where you are tuning in from in the comments below so we can all connect and share our thoughts. And please subscribe to our channel Wild West Tales, like this video, and press the hype button to help this story reach a wider audience.